Logic. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. So I have a whole episode, if you want to check it out up here below, about stories being at the center of our thinking. And I think that stories, I think I've talked about this before as well, I think that stories have a fuzzy logical structure. Maybe not perfect logic, but they do have a certain logic to them. And I think that understanding logic will actually help us write better. So I was a bit snarky at the beginning of this episode when I mentioned logic and how I don't think people know what the word logic means. I essentially said that. And I think that's actually true. I think that when I come across logic, the term logic, I think people actually don't understand what it means. I think that most people have been taught how to use logic. And I'm not trying to be mean about this. I think that I've got lucky. I think in other circumstances, I wouldn't have learned what logic is in an academic sense, and I wouldn't have learned how to use it at least marginally in an academic sense. And I don't think it's because people are stupid. I think that almost every single person in society can understand what logic is and on a certain level use basic logic. I just think it's a downfall. I think it's a failing of the education system that they actually don't teach logic to students. So what is logic? If I'm talking about logic helping us in our writing, or knowing logic helping us in our writing, then we need to understand what logic is. As I've talked about in the past, logic is our best understanding as humans of how the world actually works. If you look at the world, there are certain rules that govern the world. And I'm not actually talking about science. Science is, maybe you'd call it a subset or child of logic. Without logic, we couldn't get to science because logic is much more basic. So when I make a hypothesis in science, I'm using a form of logic. When I make a hypothesis, what I am doing is I'm looking at the world around me, and in a very basic sense, I'm looking at the world around me. I'm seeing how the world works, and I'm making a statement about that world. That is a logical thing I am doing. And what I do in science, when I make a statement about the world, is I see whether that statement is correct. I'm trying to get to the heart of what actually is true and is not true. So though logic and science have the same goal, they're trying to get to what is true and is not true, logic by itself often deals with abstractions rather than the physical world. Now, I think it would be incorrect to say that logic and scientific thinking are apart from one another. I actually think that logic exists within scientific thinking. So logic, like I said, is the parent, and then scientific thinking is the child. Without logic, we could not get to scientific thinking. Logical thinking helps us make statements like the world exists outside ourselves and the world can be measured. And by measuring the world, we can actually determine how things work within the world and whether something is true and whether something is not true within the physical world. Those statements help form the basis of scientific thinking. Think about logic more like math. Math deals with very basic components. It deals with adding things together at first. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 4 plus 4 equals 8, etc. And what happens with math is I take these very simple functions and I build these functions on top of each other. I make more complex functions, and eventually I have calculus. And for some of you, I realize that's very depressing. But logic works in a very similar way. If I were building the basic rules of logic, I would look at what is the case in the world, and that is irrefutable. For example, a thing cannot be itself and its opposite at the same time, or a person cannot be in two places at once. or basic statements such as I am a man, or that is a dog, or that thing is not living. These are very basic statements about the world, or they're very basic ideas about the world, and what somebody is doing is they are trying to take these irrefutable things and they are trying to build off those irrefutable things to make more complex ideas. This is, as I said, very similar to mathematics. So just to reiterate that again, logic looks at things on their most basic level and tries to make the most basic statements and arguments about those things, and then determines whether those statements and arguments are true, and then builds logical structures off those statements and arguments in the same manner as they arrived at them. So if that makes sense, you might be asking the question, what the heck does this have to do with writing? First, if writing has a logical structure within it, understanding logic will help us look at that logical structure more clearly, and we can take apart writing more easily to look at the components of that writing, and we can use this understanding of the components of writing and how they all fit together to make our writing better. But even if writing does not have a logical component at its core, in some sense, we can still look at writing in a logical manner, because logic helps us take things apart, whatever they are, helps us understand those things. And by understanding those things, namely writing itself, we can actually write better based on our better understanding of that writing. But more importantly than just looking at writing and seeing how writing fits together, I think logic helps us understand the content we are writing about, whether that content is emotions, situations, people, etc. This helps us. Logic helps us because reality is our subject matter when we're writing. You might be thinking, well, reality is not my subject matter because I'm writing about a fantastical world that doesn't even exist and it's just in my mind, and there's elves and there's goblins and people can breathe water in if they say a certain word. But even if you are writing fantasy, you are still writing in a real language, and you still need your writing and the story to connect to real people who exist within a real world. So you need to know how a real person works at the very least. You need to know how those people interact with the world so that you can write things into your story that those real people are going to be able to connect with. When you write, even if you are writing fantasy, you are basing what you are writing in some sense on the real world. That real world might only be the psychology of the reader, but the reader is still real. So, if logic helps us to understand our world better, if logic helps us to understand the specific details of our world better, then it is a rule set to understand our content we are trying to put into our writing. Think about certain topics that you don't know about. Say you're trying to write a historical fiction novel. In a lot of cases, we need to do research on the historical fiction we're writing, and the reason why we do research is so that we can understand that specific thing. We do research so we don't sound like idiots, so that if there is somebody who is reading it, who is a history buff about that specific time in history, they think, oh wow, they got all those details right. And it feels like I'm actually in that era. I'm actually in that situation in the past. We do it because we don't know everything, because we need to know more about that specific aspect of history to write about history effectively. If I'm trying to write something into my novel, it actually helps me if I understand that specific thing. If I'm trying to write about a specific mental illness, I'm probably going to be doing research on a mental illness. If I'm writing about war, I want to make that war come across in a way that is realistic. Otherwise, the readers are going to think, especially if they have knowledge about the topic, they're going to laugh to themselves and they're going to think, this person doesn't know what he's talking about. Maybe he gets kind of close when he's writing, but he really doesn't get close enough. It's kind of like reading a news article that you have a lot of knowledge on. And when you read the news article, you know that the person who wrote the news article has no idea at all about the topic and they're just making stuff up, or they did a quick Google search and they read a Wikipedia article on it. That's the same idea. If you're trying to describe something in reality, it actually helps to know something about that specific thing in reality. If you're trying to describe a specific emotion, it actually helps to understand that specific emotion, how people interact with that specific emotion, and how it feels to a person in that situation. If logic is something that can help us understand our reality better, it is something that can help us write better. It definitely is something that can help us write better if it helps us understand our reality better. Now, I'm not going to go into every little detail about logic right now, but in the next few episodes, I'm going to talk about the different components of logic and how these interact with our writing. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.